Welcome to today's session on leveraging Postman to test your APIs collaboratively from deployment all the way from design to deployment. So I'm Sandeep. I'm Sandeep Mursapalli, and with me we have Garrett London. We're both part of the solution architecture team within Postman. So for today, we have a quick agenda for you, right? So we will do a bit of platform overview. We'll start with the Postman platform overview, and then we'll get into how Postman is relevant for the APIs that you're deploying on Azure or the APIs that you already have on Azure API management. And then we'll touch upon a couple of demos. We'll show you a demo of how you can use Postman in the API lifecycle in the design phase while you're prototyping the APIs, getting your design right. But also we'll show the second demo, which will talk about how you can use Postman to test your APIs across your API lifecycle. So that let's get in. Almost all developers actually do know Postman, but if you haven't heard about Postman before, over the last decade, Postman has become this platform of choice for developers who are using APIs, who are testing APIs, who are trying to integrate APIs into their applications. Right. So today we do have around 28 million plus developers who are using Postman to improve their API experience. But because Postman is such a popular tool, sometimes what we see is y- y- a developer's understanding or user's experience of Postman is sometimes a bit dated. For example, if you have been using Postman 5 years ago, maybe your understanding of Postman is a REST client, or you may be using Postman as a testing tool. But sometimes that understanding kind of remains there, right? But really speaking, in the last 2 3 years, we have developed Postman into a purpose-built platform to improve the API experiences, whether you're creating APIs or whether you're consuming APIs. And that is what we wanted to show today in the slides as well as the demos that we'll touch upon. Right. So a big part of the use cases, the secret sauce of Postman really is the collections. And these collections are something that you may already be used to today. Technically speaking, collections are a group of executable API descriptions. They are interactive documentation. But practically, in terms of how we see developers using it, we see collections addressing a lot of use cases, like including whether you're demoing your API, you will create a collection for that. You're creating a recipe or a blueprint of how 3 or 4 of your APIs will come together, maybe along with some third-party SaaS APIs. You will create those recipes and tutorials in Postman as a collection and share that with other people. One of the interesting use cases we're seeing is around debugging, especially if your API is being used by third parties. A, a good way to debug is for you to kind of share the collection, send it across, save examples, and things like that. And today, from a lifecycle standpoint, we'll touch upon some of the use cases on how you will use the collections in more detail as well. Like some of the examples we'll touch upon are mocking and API lifecycle. So in terms of bringing it together from bringing Postman into the Azure context or Azure ecosystem context, really this is the life cycle that we kind of see a lot of APIs go through, right? So if you're a producer, you start with defining your API. You think about what your API is trying to solve, and that definition of an API then it goes into design. Eventually there'll be an engineering team that will go about building or developing this API. Eventually that API will go into Azure API management from a deployment standpoint. But before that, you may be using serverless, you may be using Azure VMs in order to create and deploy these APIs in the runtime as such, as a microservice. So once the API is out there, from a consumer standpoint, you would find the API through a developer portal, or sometimes you find the API through a collection shared by the API producers or other team members. From there, you will go about integrating that API into your application, and that is the life cycle of a consumer if you are using that API from a consumption standpoint. So the essence is the API lifecycle is not just one single lifecycle. There's a producer lifecycle and a consumer lifecycle, and Postman has a role to play along with other stack that you have in your API tooling, your API gateways, your serverless deployments, all of that. Right. So hopefully today we'll touch upon some of them in more detail in the demo, but This architecture diagram, I do understand that this image may not be readable. We'll give you a link to this image and maybe the slides as well. Towards the end of the session, we have a QR code that points you to a workspace. There will probably give you the link to this diagram in more detail. But at a very high level, the idea is, if you apply those two life cycles, the producer life cycle and consumer life cycle, to a workflow, you start somewhere, right? You start with either a code that gives you the spec, or you start with manual editing the specification if you're design first. In addition to those two, one thing that we're going to demo today is how you can use Postman to prototype your API and use that collection as the basis for how you generate this API specification that may eventually become an open API specification standard. Irrespective of how you do it, once you have the spec here, this spec is what is defining your API. And there is a producer lifecycle that goes in here, where you are creating this API in your containers, in your VMs. You have source control, you have SDLC, that is that this API implementation goes through. And there's a consumption angle where your developers will try to consume this API. You need to provide them interactive documentation. You need to give them the details of what this API is all about. In both these areas, there's an aspect of Postman. If you're prototyping, we'll do a quick demo of that. And if you're developing an API, we'll do a quick demo of how you can use Postman in your SDLC, test the API across your lifecycle stages. And finally, once this API goes into a portal, there again, you can point them back to this collection that is defining the documentation of this API. So with that, I'll hand it over to Garrett to walk us through the platform and show how some of this can be built in action.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sandeep. So we're going to start in Postman, and we're going to start in a workspace that's public. So you all can navigate to this if you search on the top here. And we've put this out for you to come back and reference when you need to. So what we've done is we've created a collection called the Payments API. And this is a good example of actually collaborating with your team members and developing an API together, right? So what I've done is I've actually added an example response to our endpoint, this create firm request. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to navigate, pause, that was not supposed to happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to navigate into that create firm request. And you'll notice here that we have an example response here, but our base URL is completely empty, right? We have not written or implemented this API, but I still want to collaborate with Sandeep on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the comment mode, and I'll notice that I have written a comment tagging Sandeep, and Sandeep has actually applied referencing this username variable, right? So, the payment source variable, right? So if I click on that payment source variable, now Sandeep and I are collaborating on this API design. So now I actually want to go into the request and press that send button, right? I want to be able to call something that gives me a response. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to click on the actions drop down here, and I'm going to press mock collection. I'm going to give it a name, payments mock. I'm going to save the mock server environment URL to a new environment. What this is going to do is it's going to create an environment for me. The collection uses the name base URL, so I'll just switch the variable name. But you'll notice that I actually have a mock.postman.io variable in my collection. Now what happens is if I go back to the request and I switch the environment to payments mock, you'll notice that the base URL is now filled in, and I can press send request, and I get a response from the Postman mock server. So what this does is it creates an interactive environment for Sandeep and I to actually collaborate on things. And you'll notice something, you'll notice that I actually have failed tests, right? So now we're going to navigate into more of the testing side of Postman. So I have some failed test results here. Let's look at what they are. It's expecting a certain payment type, and it's expecting a response time. So let's do something about that payment type value. So right now it's accepting a debit or credit value. And if I navigate to my test tab, you'll see that I have a test written here that expects my response to have one of these values. Now, if I go to my example response, you'll see that payment type is transfer, and this is not an accepted value, which is why my test failed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this back to debit. I'm going to navigate back to my request. I'm going to send the request again. And you'll notice that all my tests pass because the payment type has been updated in my mock server. So mock servers are an amazing way to collaborate with your team members, right? Sandeep can also choose the payments mock URL. And then we can all work together. We can design this API. And then what we can do with this collection, which Sandeep mentioned earlier, is we can actually generate an open API schema from a Postman collection. So Postman has a utility in our public workspace, which you can additionally search for, that actually takes a Postman collection ID and it converts it into an open API specification. So now, what are we going to do with that open API specification? If we navigate to the APIs tab here, this is where the payments API specification is actually uploaded. And now we're going to go into another Postman testing feature, which is called API governance. Now, what will happen is my definition file will load from my remote repository. My definition file will load from my remote repository where the definition is stored. And you'll notice that I actually have an error here that all of my operations need summaries, right? So this is a rule that people on my Postman team have set that said all of your specifications need a summary. So you'll notice that the second that I add a summary to this, my rule violations are gone, okay? And so if I remove that summary, you'll notice that my rule violations show I have an error. So this is going to be on the API governance side of Postman, which actually allows your organization to create consistently correct schemas and put your own logic in it. So now I've shown a little bit about API governance. I've shown how specifications can be incorporated into Postman. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into that API that I've uploaded. You can see I have the same collection here as well as my definition. And what I can do is I can additionally hook up CI/CD. And so the question is, what do you use Postman CI/CD for? Postman actually allows you to run collections as part of your CI pipeline. So you'll notice that this collection is linked to my API, as well as I have GitHub Actions connected. And this is done through OAuth GitHub flow. So what I can do is I can actually copy this Postman command, this YAML file. I can use it in my GitHub Actions template. And as you can see, what it's doing is it's actually running a Postman collection. And so before I actually merge code to the master branch, I can run a Postman collection. I can validate that those tests pass any business case or logic that I need. And then I can either fail or pass the build pipeline depending on that collection run. Additionally, you'll see that we can actually do the governance checks that I did in this definition tab as well on CI/CD. So from the presentation, we started developing a brand new API inside of a collection. We mocked it so that Sandeep and I can collaborate together. We converted it to an open API specification in order to generate code or generate collections or mocks or monitors. And then what we did was we hooked up CI/CD and went full circle on the testing lifecycle. So this is Postman from design to deployment, testing, iterating, and collaborating inside of the platform.
Awesome. Thank you, Garrett. So these are a couple of demos we wanted to show you. One, how you can leverage the prototyping within Postman as the baseline for generating your microservice. And once you have the microservice, how then you can use Postman to eventually integrate with your CI process along with your microservices development. And finally, as the API becomes ready for consumption, obviously all the collections that you have created, all the documentation that you have within Postman can then be leveraged to make the consumption experience a lot smoother and easier for your API consumers. So thank you for joining. We do have a couple of additional resources that you can use to learn a little bit more about Postman. But more importantly, this QR code and this short link will take you to the public workspace that Garrett used for the demo. And in that public workspace, we do also have a lot of documentation, especially on how Postman is relevant for an Azure API management user, or like if you're in the Azure ecosystem, you're developing your microservices in Azure. We have listed some use cases here. We'll keep iterating on this public workspace. Do let us know if there is feedback. We would like to work with you on improving how the messaging of how we can use Postman with Azure. Thank you all. Have a good day.